Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing medically assisted dying laws in Canada. Now, Dr. Gained, since the criteria changed to allow not just access to medically assisted dying for terminal patients, but also permits it for non-terminal patients, do we know how many people are accessing it who are non-terminal? How common a problem is this? And is it going to increase? Is the problem going to increase?
So we have heard of anecdotal reports across the country, but in terms of the national statistics, there's always a lag in those being presented. So the latest statistics we have nationally are from 2020, and that is before this expansion to non-dying disabled. But I think those statistics are also very revealing, because what they show is that from 2016 to 2019, 3 years since the introduction, when death needed to be reasonably foreseeable, in that short time, 2% of all Canadian deaths were by MAID. And they increased year on year. And by 2020, which is the year before this latest MAID expansion, 2.5% were of all Canadians who died by MAID. They remarkably call it a growth rate in the death rate. A remarkable term. And some provinces are even higher. So Quebec and BC are at 3 and 4%, and some areas are even higher than that. Vancouver Island is between 7 to 9%, it's believed, and it's been dubbed the assisted suicide capital of the world. Now, keep in mind, this is all before people would be able to apply for life suffering. This is before the expansion to non-dying disabled. So, you mentioned earlier that some people had concerns about a slippery slope. When you think about those numbers, when you think about the rapid expansion to non-dying disabled, the planned expansion to people with sole mental illness by next year, with people, some expansionists talking about the need to expand MAID to children. To me, there is no slippery slope. We have fallen off a cliff.
I want to get to some of those issues, in particular the mental illness and access for children, if that's going to be a potential. But first, I want to talk about something that seemed pretty disturbing that you wrote about, Mr. Zhu, which is the concern that the government has looked into the cost savings of expanding assisted suicide. And now that sounds pretty dark. Helping a medically complex and vulnerable person kill themselves is cheaper than using taxpayer money to support them when alive. Is it as dark as it sounds? What can you tell me about what the government has said about cost savings of medically assisted dying?
Right. I mean, it sounds dark because it is dark, right? So last year, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who is an officer of Parliament, published a report about the fiscal impact of Bill C7. So he crunched numbers, and I'm happy to give you some of the numbers, which are remarkable. Under the 2016 law, assisted suicide saved the Canadian taxpayer $86 million a year. Under the new law, Bill C7, there are additional savings of $62 million a year estimated for the first year of its full implementation. By contrast, each case of MAID costs the federal government and the taxpayer $2,327. So it's a no-brainer really from a fiscal point of view. Long-term care for chronic conditions, for incurable conditions is expensive. MAID is cheap, and obviously that creates incredibly perverse incentives. Because in Canada, we are obviously committed to good fiscal governance, but I'm afraid that this is being used or may be used in the future as a rationale for expanding MAID. Now, of course, the report itself says that the cost savings are not a ground on their own for expanding or legalizing assisted suicide, but it is very hard to believe that at a time when the medical system, especially with aging populations, inflation, and all those things going on, is coming under strain, it is very hard to believe that there isn't some administrators, some politicians thinking, well, MAID is a wonderful way to reduce some of the pressures in the healthcare system because it's so cheap.
Mr. Zhu, we've got about a minute, but have you heard any stories of people who have been pressured to pursue MAID? Are there reports like that?
Yes, so far it is anecdotal because it is this sort of evidence is not being systematically collected, but it was the case, for instance, of a man who was disabled, who essentially, he was in long-term care facility in Ontario, and so basically, there's no better way to put it, they abused him in order to try to pressure him into assisted suicide. Now the case is under investigation and he gives testimony to Parliament, so it is so it has not been corroborated by judicial authority. But I think there's no reason to doubt that this sort of thing is going on at a sort of low level under the radar across the country, and we simply just we really don't know what is the extent of it. All we know is that we have reports, quite credible reports of this happening in Canada.
It's incredibly disturbing. We've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, Dr. Gainey, I want to talk to you about the expansion of medically assisted dying for people who are suffering from mental illness. We will be right back.